Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and yesterday we were talking about the scene where Mufasa and Simba are sitting on the hillside looking out over the kingdom, and Mufasa's like, one day the sun's going to set on my time as king and rise on your time as king, kiddo, and then everything that the light touches, that is going to be yours. And we talked about how the most natural read on that is that Mufasa is talking to Simba about something that is going to happen to Simba, and it would not be a natural read to watch that movie and come away and be like, oh, he's talking about somebody else way down the line, much later. No, the simplest read here is that he's talking to the person he's actually talking to. Likewise, we're looking at Matthew chapter 24 and a conversation that is happening between Jesus and his disciples. They're having a back and forth. The disciples want to know, when are you going to return and what are going to be the signs of your return? And Jesus gives a rather complex, multifaceted answer to that question, where the take-home is some stuff's going to happen. You're going to have some hints. When it's really time, you should be able to identify the basics of it because you're good at interpreting the world around you. You'll be able to interpret this. And then after these things occur, the Son of Man will return, and that is going to be unmissable. So then as he continues to talk with his disciples, to his disciples, and I believe with his disciples in view, he gives them this little nugget we've been working on for a couple days here. Jesus talking here. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. These things, then, a phrase he uses twice in this passage, are clearly referring to all of the signs, the hints, the stuff that indicates that the culminating event is getting closer so that they can be prepared for and anticipate the culminating event, which is, of course, the return of the Son of Man. So then what's the most natural read on the phrase, this generation, in this context? Well, I think the most natural read is whoever he's talking to right there. He's got the 12 disciples. They're alive right now. They have contemporaries who are also alive, and they asked for themselves when they're going to see these signs and what the signs are going to be. So in light of that, the most natural read on what Jesus is actually promising here, I think, is this. Those guys right there within their lifetimes, they would see the wars and rumors of wars, and they would see the rumblings. They would even see some kind of profaning. They would see a profound moment of political and military pressure. They would even hear people making claims about false messiahs arriving right now. They would feel pressure to follow false messiahs. But all of those things are just a prelude, a run-up to the main event, which is the future predicted return of the Son of Man in an unmissable way. However, I think the most natural read on Jesus' remarks here leaves ambiguity as to whether they will see the actual return of the Son of Man or not. He's not talking about whether or not they'll see the culminating event. He's talking about what they asked him about, which is the signs leading up to that. And in fact, we get some other details as you flip around the New Testament that indicate that the disciples were maybe not 100% clear on who was going to live to see what events, and there might have even been some tension within the disciples about Jesus maybe indicating that some of them would live to see these events, but that others would be left off this list. There was some confusion, but acknowledging fully that this would have been difficult for them to wrap their brains around, we still have these clear lines that are being uttered. These things, yeah, you should be able to get a sense of that. And then when those things have happened, which this generation will be alive to see, sometime later, maybe not very long, maybe really long as people perceive of a really long time, there will be this culminating event that will be the return of the Son of Man, that will be the reckoning of things and the beginning of the end of history as we understand it. Now, in fairness, that is just my very best take on what Matthew 24 is saying in the immediate context. If you go out beyond that, you run into some other challenging passages, and then you maybe have to come back to Matthew 24 and try to reconcile that with some stuff that maybe fits better with how you might tend to read one little part of Daniel or something in Revelation or something in the letters to the Thessalonians. And I get that, and that is complex, and people do different things with it. And as a result of those pressures, there are a few different, I think, more complex reads on this passage and what Jesus means by these things and by this generation. Here are some of those other reads. 1, Some very smart people will go back and look at just one chapter earlier in chapter 23, where Jesus is issuing this series of invectives against the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And then he says, you're guilty of all of the blood of the righteous from Abel to Zechariah. And I tell you the truth that all this will come upon this generation. Well, some people look at generation there and they're like, it's a rejection of the Jews and the Jewish religion and the Jewish leadership entirely. Maybe the rest of the New Testament indicates that there's deliverance for the Jewish people, like in a very serious way. There's tons of Jewish Christians running around in the rest of the New Testament. All of his disciples are Jewish. I don't think it's a wholesale rejection of them that he means there by generation in Matthew 23. I think what you're getting there is either Jesus saying, this immediate group of people who are alive at the same time I am, you're the ones who are going to see this whole thing ultimately break. All that you've treasured and loved and built into with your weird, twisted up religious system, you're going to see it break before most of you are dead. And then that would, of course, be pointing toward the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It is also possible that maybe there he means your ilk, that this group of people, that has been an interpretation that some have latched onto. I think Aaron did a good job of articulating where some people are coming from with that read on it when he talked about this a few episodes back. It could be. Some people look at what we're dealing with this generation in Matthew 24 and the end of things, and they would say, nah, we're not talking directly to Simba or the disciples here. We're talking to a later generation. We're talking to a group of people, an era of Christianity and the church that will carry on for centuries, even millennia. And at the end of this era, the generation not meaning a biological generation, but an intellectual, theological, people of God generation, then somewhere at the end of that, all of these things will come to pass. I understand that that case can be made and that we have a little bit of extra biblical support for the Greek word behind generation being used that way, but come on. All theological systems aside, you just read Matthew 24 with me. It looks like he's telling his disciples what they can expect in response to a question they asked that affects them. Still, there are some very smart people who interpret this passage, number one, as saying that generation here means a metaphorical generation that will start at the resurrection and ascension of Christ, the beginning of the age of the church, and it will last until whenever the end times come around. Still, there are others who would say that the pivot word here is this, not this generation. And they would say that Jesus has shifted here what's in view. He's no longer talking to these disciples as though they are the generation in view. But what he's saying is sometime far, 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 far from now, all of these things will unfold, and they'll unfold quickly when they happen. So whatever generation is alive when it all starts, that generation will see it all go down, including the return of the Son of Man. It could be, but if we're trying to start our interpretation with what seems like the natural read here in Matthew chapter 24, that doesn't seem like the most natural read to me. Still, other very smart people who I respect and have probably thought about it way harder than me would argue that Jesus is talking to the disciples and is talking to their generation, and that literally everything that is a sign of the return of the Son of Man leading up to that and the return of the Son of Man, that it's all going to happen in their lifetimes, and that if you look at the details of the destruction of the temple and the Roman conquest of Judea in 70 AD, just a few decades after Jesus said these words, then you can see that in a way Christ somehow did return. Maybe not everybody caught it, but he did. And if you go over and you look at Luke's account of Jesus giving the same speech, maybe there are more specifics there that point to this total completion of all of the prediction of the end time stuff from the New Testament and from the Olivet Discourse here in Matthew 24 that happens in 70 AD. And what's been going on since then is really Christ's significant, long-lasting reign on earth, and that the next resolution is a complete realization of that reign of Christ, and that we're actually in a different era of the history of God's working with people than many other Christians historically have imagined that we are in. Again, very smart, competent people embrace this read on the text, and though I think it is a somewhat natural read, it runs into one big obvious problem. There's no meaningful record of some kind of sign in the sky that Jesus was describing back here just one passage earlier. And there's no meaningful record of the Son of Man returning in glory on the clouds. You would think Christians would have been really motivated to jot that down or something real quick if they saw it happening. So like the signs stuff, you could make a case. Oh, yeah, Titus, Vespasian, the Romans, the persecutions that came after that. People needed to flee to the mountains to avoid the horrible things that ended up happening at places like Masada. Ghost stories linger about that stuff to this day. It's very easy to imagine unprecedented political, military horrors that this generation, meaning the generation that we're looking at with the disciples here, they would have never seen anything like this before. And it would have shaken them to the core. And it did involve a profaning of the temple. I mean, it involved a destruction of the temple. What could be a greater profaning than that? And so I guess I'm a little bit understanding of this position, at least in part, because I think you can make a really good case for these signs. Maybe they were fulfilled in the Roman conquest of Judea. Maybe that's there. Maybe that is what Jesus had in view. And if so, the disciples' generation would have been alive to see it and to recall back his words. Where it thins out is that I don't think there's anything that points to the actual return of the Son of Man around 70 AD. But that isn't a pressure point for me, because the most natural read on this conversation is that all the signs are going to be evident to you in your lifetimes, and sometime after that, there's going to be a return of the Son of Man, and you won't need any signs for that. Once we're there and we're locked and loaded and everything's cocked and ready to go, whenever that trigger gets pulled by God, there'll be a real loud bang, and you will know it happened. So I think the most obvious read here is you guys who asked the question right now in the 1st century AD, you will see the signs, and everything will be locked and loaded and ready to go. And at some point, maybe sooner, maybe later, the return of the Son of Man will occur, and when that trigger gets pulled, nobody will have any debate or question as to whether things are going down. Clearly, though, the call, the take-home in all of this is Jesus' words are authoritative. He has the right to say these things. He is correct. You don't need all of the information here. That'll be made clear in the very next passage. And the call of the kingdom citizen, be it the disciples then or you and me now, is to be faithful as citizens of the kingdom, as ambassadors of the king, as followers of the king in the meantime. As is so often the case, any questions we have lingering about what Jesus meant there are going to be clarified by the context as we move into the next passage. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.